Excellent. Welcome, everybody. Get yourself in, get your feet put up. That didn't make any sense, did it? Get yourself comfortable, put your feet up, make yourself a cup of tea. We can't see you. Hopefully you can see us. I'm going to put a message in the chat. So let's have a look. Tell us who you are, where you're from, what you've had for your tea. Oh!
My bad.
Let's have a look. So, hi everybody. What have you had for your tea? Hi Amy. I was thinking, let's do something different, but it doesn't matter what I ask you. You just tell me where you're from and what you've had for your tea. So, I think that's kind of the universe telling me just to stick to something simple. So, come in. Get yourself comfortable, get yourself a cup of tea or whatever you're drinking. Tell us what your name is, where you're from, tell us what you've had for your tea.
Muffin pie.
If you're very organised, you might have had your
tea. Hungry.
Yeah.
Has anybody had any birthday cake?
Yeah, birthday cake. Oh, Lisa's had an ice cream sundae with fresh cream and warm caramel sauce. That's halfway there. Halfway to birthday cake. Oh, excellent. Prawns and rice. So tell us whether you're a student or a social worker or a practitioner or I've run out of options. Like, tell us
just a random person.
Whether we've just got students or people who might have a bit more of an idea than most of us. Not Siobhan, obviously. Siobhan knows quite a lot of things.
You just
graduated. There's a lot of people just graduated. So I'm sure Chris and Kat will identify with you there.
Not quite there yet, nearly.
I was going to say feel your pain, but I thought that probably wasn't very positive.
We're feeling a lot of pain, aren't we?
We certainly are.
We've gone international again. We've got a student here from the Philippines. We've got Syed here again from Pakistan, I think.
Excellent.
So
I can't even keep up with this chat.
I know, it's so fast.
I know, it's fast, isn't it? It's fast.
You've got read at speed.
Ready to start. So thanks ever so much for opening us up again, Kelly, and how you get everybody in and comfortable. And I can see people saying they're really excited for tonight, as am I. I am really excited about tonight's webinar, partly because I can just sit back and listen tonight, which is fabulous, and I'm really looking forward to that and to what I'm going to learn tonight, but partly because this is such an important topic that all of us need to engage with. So the focus and the title is about children impacted by immigration control, but actually this is something that all of us need to be thinking about as a follow-up, for example, to our webinar on anti-racist practice, and generally looking at working towards becoming more activist in social work and more radical in social work. Everybody really needs to engage with these topics. So I am really thrilled that we have been joined by Nick and by Rita, who will introduce themselves later. So tonight Nick has control of the slides and I will be joining you in the chat, which is fabulous. So Nick, do you want to turn us on to the next slide?
I already fluffed it up within like 30 seconds of the room opening.
Fine, it's absolutely fine. Thank you, Nick. If you want to move us to the next slide, because if anybody has been following today on social media, you'll know that Diana, a member of the Social Work Student Connect team, is 21 today. We are not going to subject anybody to singing. We did have a little think about it, but we thought, no, you know, everyone is going to switch off straight away if the team starts singing happy birthday. So this is our attempt at a non-singing happy birthday for Diana, who hasn't seen this, I think. So this is a bit of a surprise for Diana. But I know that tonight's webinar is a special one for Diana, not just because she's 21 today, but I didn't know if you want to say something tonight, Diana.
Well, first of all, thank you. That looks so amazing. I need that. I'm going to put that on my wall. But I am really excited about this webinar, partly because I came to this country alongside my family as an asylum seeker when I was 2 years old, and the journey to where I am now has been like really difficult. And even though we didn't come in contact with social workers, we still had the fear of going to the local authorities or getting in contact with social workers because we felt as though we would probably get deported or get sent back home. But we did experience a lot of poverty, a lot of racism, and it was a large amount of isolation from the communities around us. I guess when you move into a new country, they tend to put you in an area where there's all like refugees, and that area is kind of isolated from other people. But I guess with this webinar, I'm interested in seeing how the link between social work and migrant children and the impact of immigration controls really looks like, because I wasn't aware of it in my first year, so I want to know more. And maybe Nick can, you know, employ me in the future.
So after a job,
your wage, you've got a job.
So thank you ever so much, Diana, for sharing with us there, and happy birthday to you from not just all of us in the team, but I think from probably everybody in the audience. I think you've probably got loads of happy birthdays going on there in the chat. So thanks ever so much. And I think I saw the word earlier, inspiration, and you are an inspiration, Diana. So thank you very much for that. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Nick, and I'm going to sit back and listen and learn. Thank you very much, Nick.
Hi. First of all, thanks everybody for coming tonight, actually, because I really don't think this is an issue that we really talk about that much. Before I go any further, I really wanted to introduce tonight's real expert, because while I know a little bit about law and I can probably chat a good policy game, I've not personally, as you can probably tell, being a very, very English person, not experienced immigration controls, not been subject to them, and therefore can't offer much in that regard, apart from the fact that I know a little bit of law. So Rita is with me today, and Rita is one of the members of our parents group, but also co-facilitates those weekly meetings. And Rita, would you couple of minutes about you and where you are now?
Hello everyone, good evening. My name is Rita. I'm a part of the parents group for Together with Migrant Children, which we organize every week, and I'm also co-facilitating with Sarah and Nick. I have first-hand experience with social worker, the immigration system, and I'm here today to share a little bit of my experience with you. Thank you all for coming in tonight. Over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Rita. So just like 30 seconds about the charity in itself. We're a very, very small charity. There is a whole 4 people that work here. One of my colleagues, Sarah, who's is around on the webinar, and I've seen her in the chat, so she might be able to answer things that come up in the chat, and it'll be a really, really good test of her knowledge that I can draw on tomorrow. Sarah's about, and I'm sure she'll join in and possibly add a little bit of context there as well. In terms of the charity itself, we've been around since 2016. We are one of the only charities that provide really, really specialist kind of support specifically to do with children and immigration control, but without any restrictions, which I'll talk about in a little minute. We provide casework, advocacy, legal challenge, one-on-one support, summer activity programs, parents groups, and kind of everything else in between. And I also do quite a lot of this sort of thing, and kind of like trawl around various unis talking about radical practice, radical theory, and my specialist subject is really how things in welfare and social care law interact with immigration controls, really. What I wanted to start off with, I'm not sure if this is going to be popular or not really, was a few assumptions about the position that I'm coming from tonight. First one, social work is not a universal good, which hopefully most people here will kind of agree with. Really good example is to look back to the role social work played in apartheid, for example, and in enforcing racist policy that effectively divided societies. Social work played a huge role in the development of apartheid policy and its enforcement through othering and government policy enforcement, really. And it's not just there in the UK. There are various harms involved in social work and various kind of things that have been going on, from care proceedings, rise of children going into care, lack of family support, really, really poor, unlawful decisions taken by both individual practitioners and organisations. And that carries huge implications for both how the sector is seen, but also in how it works, and recognising how that power, but also how its failings over time, has painted this picture of where it is now. Specifically to immigration, there are big problems with the way the Home Office, local authorities and people interact with each other. So, for instance, there is one computer system that local authorities access on one end and Home Office on the other. In 9 local authorities in the UK, there is an embedded Home Office worker in children's services who will attend child in need assessments, threaten people to go home, and various other things in what are supposed to be welfarist kind of situations. And this kind of idea of how this relationship is really needs to be looked at. There's also this habit for what's called a fraud first approach, and this is, I'm going for a lack of funding provided to statutory services in terms of counter fraud strategies. Credit check before a child welfare check is a really good example of what happens when you approach NRPF teams. Alongside that, there's already a very complex relationship between social work and the state, and a very big tension between government policy, especially over the last, let's say, is it 8 years now, and social work values and ethics, and how those two interact. And I firmly believe that for these issues to happen, everyone must take a stand and actually take an activist stance, which is much more in kind of a radical camp. Thinking about my 3 initial assumptions for migration before we actually get into things, there's no arguing that the last couple of weeks have highlighted really, really starkly the issues involving migration and human rights in the UK. For instance, the Britain First lot who have been off knocking on hotel doors all over the country to find asylum seekers, or as they will call them, illegal entrants into the UK, to the really divisive narratives around the Channel crossings, and generally migration and Brexit, that relationship, and this kind of migration as a dirty thing that's been painted in society. The activist lawyer narrative was one of my favourites, when the Home Office were like, actually, activist lawyers, who, by the way, are following the rule of law, are making it harder to deport people, in brackets which they didn't say, illegally, because if it wasn't challengeable, why would they be doing it? The other thing that I want to really put out there, and I want to stay in people's minds throughout this entire webinar really, is that through both the delivery of services are very guilty for this, in the painting of this deserving and undeserving migrant narrative that we see. So consider the Syrian resettlement schemes, a really good example, where it was, okay, if you fit this category of good refugee, so you come from Syria and you are impacted by this specific thing, then you can come with a visa to the UK. The fact is migration and life in general is messy. And therefore there are great groups of people that fall subject to immigration control. There was a brilliant study done a couple of years ago which actually found that the Home Office in their immigration raids stopped, it was around 90% of people who were of a black ethnicity, but a quarter of those are British, but they're not racially profiling. Is the really important thing to remember. And obviously there's a much bigger thing to migration, including all the people who have every other reason to be in the UK, so human rights grounds, derivative rights, people on visas, and we need to get away from this kind of good, bad migrant, good, bad asylum seeker kind of narrative in thinking about how we frame these issues. The reality is that there are loads of organisations that work with migration in the UK. A lot of them are very specific and like, okay, we will only work with asylum seekers. Well, what about the foreign national parent of a British child who, unless they get sorted, that British child will be deprived of their British citizenship? So it's a really important thing to kind of think about as we go through this. So I've put pictures of 2 people, Lynn Matumba, who was 2, and her mother, and also Mercy, who Mercy, hopefully people have seen the news in the last couple of weeks, and Mercy starved to death whilst on asylum support in asylum accommodation in Scotland. And Lynn Matumba, the 2-year-old, starved to death alongside her mother a few years ago whilst on support provided under Section 17 of the Children Act by a local authority, due to not being provided for well enough during that period of time. There's a good handful of serious case reviews which specifically relate to the correlation between immigration control and child welfare. And it's really important that we recognise that the harm here is very, very real in terms of destitution and the denial of basic welfare provisions. The one thing I will say to remember before I pretty much hand over to Rita for a little while actually, is this is deliberate. And this is a choice that the government is currently making. So in 2012, Theresa May said that the aim is to create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal immigrants, not forgetting that the start of the hostile environment was actually New Labour, who introduced the no recourse to public funds condition, for example. So it's all well and good saying all those horrible Tories, but actually there is a very, very long and big history across parties of quite harmful controls when we think about immigration. But definitely this government has really, really gone to town, as I'm going to show you now. So imagine that with immigration control, what that actually means. So Rita, this is a good point for you, I think. So in terms of immigration control and thinking about people who are subject to it, what's your experiences within your community on how immigration is viewed?
In terms of immigration control, I'll start by talking about asylum seekers. Yeah, they don't get enough. I don't know about now, but they don't get enough funds. They don't have like social worker. They believe that they treat asylum seekers as though they are not citizens. They don't deserve a lot of benefit. They don't deserve a lot of support. An example is an asylum immigrant does not have a social worker, doesn't have access to so many things, no right to work, you know. And there's also a control in terms of when you seek asylum, if you do not pull through, immediately you lose the accommodation that is given to you. So as a result, in a way, people are also destitute and they also are afraid to go back to their country. And then also, in addition to what you've talked about here, the whole idea of social workers, most people are afraid. They're afraid to approach the authorities because fear of deportation, fear of maybe they will take their children from them. And as a result of that, they go into isolation. They find themselves living in a very uncomfortable situation. You can have a family of 4, a family of 6, staying in one room because they're afraid to approach the authorities. And also in terms of, to add to some of the initial assumptions here, people also do not want to come out. Don't want to come out because there is this belief that the social worker is not going to give you, okay, like some people in terms of racism now, they don't want to come out because they believe that, oh, the social worker might favor a white person than a black person. There's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of things going on when it comes to approaching the local authorities and immigration. You don't have the right to work. You can't fend from your family. A lot. Like I have a case of someone that approached the local authority. After going to get to the phase of having a social worker, she got an accommodation that was not conducive. The roof was leaking, and then she was trying to get the social worker to come and see where she's staying with her kids. The environment was not conducive for them. It took a long time for the social worker to come and see the condition, and also it took a long time for them to get access to funds. Yes, they gave them accommodation, but there was no fund to provide for them. So they had to turn to the nearest charity that was assisting them with food bank, clothes, and things like that. You know, and there are also people that, as a result of their immigration control, They've had to cancel their driving license. Some of them had bank account restrictions. So they have also been made destitute in a way because of that condition.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In terms of the law around who is subject to immigration control, the answer is a lot of people, effectively. So obviously, if you are a British citizen, you are not subject to immigration control. If you have indefinite leave to remain in the UK, you are not subject to immigration control. Pretty much everyone else is in one way or another. So, for instance, those who have no leave to remain in the UK are subject to immigration control, but also those who have leave subject to a condition of no recourse to public funds. So when we talk about immigration control, we move beyond talking just about asylum seekers who also don't have a right to work, for example. There's a campaign about that at the moment, which I'll include in the links on the email that goes out tomorrow, all the way through to people who have no leave to remain in the UK. Or a good example is a phone call into our advice line a few weeks ago of a woman on a spousal visa in the UK. Now, spousal visas are tied to your spouse. That's a condition of your visa. So the second he horrifically abused her and she left him, she became unlawfully present in this country and instantly had everything ripped out from underneath her. This is what we're talking about when we talk about immigration control. So we talk about people who have a lawful basis to be here, but are subject to some form of restrictions. And then we talk about a group of people who, for whatever reason, don't have current stay in the UK. Now, with that in mind, and this next slide is really, really busy, but for a really good reason. Just want people to imagine for just a few moments if they couldn't do any of this. So what we're talking about is no access to a bank account, no access to a driving license, fear of enforcement, £3,000 for having your baby in an NHS hospital, no free school meals, no pupil premium, border enforcement by landlords because landlords are fined if they don't check the immigration status of their tenants. Sharing of data between schools and the Home Office to target immigration enforcement at school gates. Difficulty accessing domestic abuse refuges because they're tied to housing benefit, which you're not eligible for. Sharing of patient data between the NHS and immigration enforcement. We're the only country in Europe to have indefinite detention in immigration cases. That's non-criminal detention. Service gatekeeping, and obviously no recourse to public funds, which for those of you that may not know that term is effectively a condition attached to someone's leave or something if you don't have leave that basically means you can't access housing, benefits, any form of kind of welfare, or even child benefit is excluded by that as well. Rita. This is probably a good bit for you. In terms of things like maternity charging and the NHS, what's the experience of your community with accessing healthcare, for example?
They have to pay. They have to pay because they do not have the right to public funds. So there's a case of a lady that was pregnant, and then when she got to the hospital, she had to have a C-section. So she was put on a payment plan. She has to pay. And if you don't pay, if you want to renew your visa, there's a part where you need to pay for medicals. It's going to affect your application because it's not free.
No. And an NHS debt over £500 is a reason that can be used to refuse your leave to remain.
Yes, it can be used to refuse your leave to remain. Yes, that's true.
What about the impact of employment on your community, Rita, and the inability to work? Would you say it put people in a position where they're forced to undertake bad work like housekeeping and low wage stuff?
Yes, it does. It does. It puts them in that condition. They've got family, they've got children to feed, and they don't have access to so many things. So they are forced to take jobs, demeaning jobs, to fund for their family.
So what we often find in our casework, Rita, is that quite a lot of people that we work with have been in, say, situations where it's almost been domestic servitude. So they've been given a room, for instance, in a house in exchange for unpaid work. Or we also work with a lot of women who have ended up doing things like sex work in order to secure a roof over there and their children's heads. how would you say that's quite common amongst people that you know to end up in situations like that?
Yes, it's very common. They call them live-in nannies. They provide a room for them with their kids, and they pay them probably 300, 400 pounds a month. They tell them after all they're not paying for any accommodation, and that's all they can afford to give them. It's there's a case of a lady that had to do something like that. She wasn't happy because she was taking care of 2 kids, so she didn't have time for her own child. And most times in this situation, your child is treated as a second entity. It's not a good thing for a mother to be living in a house where your child is not allowed to come into the living room to interact with fellow kids. Emotionally, psychologically, the environment is not even good for the child. It's a very common situation mainly amongst the women that find themselves in such condition. Yes.
Okay. And one of the things I'll pick up on here is about victims of crime. Because of policy, for instance, if a victim of crime comes to report a crime, it's more likely that the victim of crime will be referred to immigration enforcement than it is that their actual crime that they've been a victim of will actually be investigated. And I think that one thing sums up an issue of justice in this hostile environment when we start to think about why this is happening, and the fact that, going back to this again, I'm going to go back to this a lot, all of this is a choice. This is a choice that as a country the UK is choosing to do. So all of this is designed, and in terms of policy and the impact it has on people, in my experience, it's a very effective policy in terms of how it drives people into really, really severe destitution. Actually, I have one more question for you, Rita, on this one, if that's all right. I've put something up here about a culture of disbelief. In terms of like when you've approached social services for help, and also others have too, what's your experience been of feeling believed in that process and feeling like you've been listened to?
What's the word I'm going to use? It's a big relief, because most times they don't even believe that they can get that help. They don't think it can happen to them. So when they get there and they go through the process, they are being interviewed, and then maybe the caseworker tells them that, oh, we're going to be placed in a temporary room. It's a big relief. Some people are so emotional about it. Why some? I don't even know how to put it, but it's a big relief for them, because they didn't believe that kind of thing could actually happen to them. It's a deep rooted thing in an average illegal immigrant in this country.
Okay. And then there's obviously times where it doesn't go right. So I'm just going to draw on a case that we worked on a couple of years ago. We had a mother and 2 children. The children were, I think, 8 and 6 at the time that we worked with them. And when they were referred to us, they were sleeping in the waiting room of an A&E, having been known to the local authority for about 2 months in terms of their housing and homelessness issues. Now, the reason why the local authority was refusing to support this family revolved around an assessment of mum's nails. So they'd turned around in a child in need assessment and said, well, her nails are really tidy and they're manicured, so she couldn't possibly be destitute.
What?
So this mum and her kids spent around 3 weeks, mixture of street sleeping in A&Es, before coming to our attention as a service. There was then a very long, protracted High Court hearing in which eventually it was recognised for what it was, which was a totally irrational child in need assessment in terms of how it was delivered, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how this looks in statutory practice shortly. I think what I'm getting at when I use this case is that from the point that she approached that local authority and from the point she started talking to practitioners, she was disbelieved, discredited, and then everything else followed. So quite often the first step in a child in need assessment when considering these sorts of cases is a credit check, followed by a Home Office check. sometimes the kids aren't even seen or spoken to. And one of the things that really gets me when we start thinking about some of these issues that are in here is there is a big culture of both disbelief but also blame. You know, so
Yes.
if you're not, why are you here? You don't deserve this, almost. I've known 6-hour interrogation sessions by social workers sat alongside fraud officers as part of a child in need assessment in local authority offices, going through bank statements line by line by line by line by line, justify, to the point of having to go to those friends to get letters from them, really demeaning process to prove that this £10 2 years ago is indeed from them. That's the level of disbelief and scrutiny that we see in quite a lot of cases that we work with. There are
it's a very common situation. I don't know why there's a disbelief, but I would say if for every 100, 97 goes through that process. And then sometimes I would say another problem is the cultural barrier, because the way I express myself might not be the same way you would express yourself. And some people are not good at expressing themselves. And that's for that reason, they tend to say their story is false.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to say their story is false just because she's not consistent in what she's saying. And it could also be because she's distorted. That's why she's not consistent. But they tend to say because you're not consistent in what you're saying, then your story is not true.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
It's really helpful. So obviously when we're thinking about children who are impacted by immigration control, like any other child, they come into contact with statutory social work for a big variety of reasons, just like anybody does. And obviously with this group of people, there is a very specific thing around this destitution and extreme poverty that's presented here. Now, obviously, if you've got no recourse to public funds, you can't work, you have no way of making any legitimate money, your only option is quite significant exploitation usually, then there is no safety net apart from the Children Act and the Care Act, which are both delivered by Children's Services and Adult Services respectively within local authorities. Now, obviously, the Children Act under Section 17, I think it's Section 17.6, but don't quote me on that quite yet. I will send through specific legislation in the follow-up email as well, but provides that local authorities have a power, and it's really important that this is a power, not a duty at this stage, to provide things like accommodation and financial support where it would relieve child in need. When we think about child in need, we talk about a child who is not likely to achieve or maintain a reasonable standard of health or development. That's the bare bones of the law there. And is quite low as a threshold in comparison to, for instance, significant harm. So the bar for an assessment is actually quite low when we talk child in need, although you wouldn't believe it sometimes that the bar is where it stands. But legally speaking, it's quite a low bar. Now, where this starts intersecting with, and also the Care Act applies here too for those of you who work with adults, is there's this little thing here called Section 54, and it's Schedule 3 of the Nationality, Immigration and Asylum Act 2002, which bars certain groups of people from accessing support under Section 17 of the Children Act and support under the Care Act. So a local authority can, in some cases, lawfully refuse and leave a child unsupported on the basis of one of those immigration statuses. So what we're talking about, refused asylum seekers who have not complied or are not taking reasonable steps to return. Person in third country, so refugee status for another thing, and those who are in the UK, what the Home Office call unlawfully, but going back to ideas around the hostile environment, for instance, we're going to pick apart this word unlawfully shortly. Now, in these cases where you have this Section 54 exclusion in place, the local authority do something called a human rights assessment, which effectively looks at whether refusing support and a return to a country of origin would resolve that destitution. So think for a moment about, let's say, someone who came in on a visitor's visa into the UK 17 years ago and has never regularised their status, has a few kids and everything's been under the radar for quite a while. Now, for her and those couple of kids to actually regularise their status, you're probably talking £5,000 to £10,000 every 2.5 years for a decade is what's needed to maintain that limited leave to remain. Now, you can get something called a fee waiver to waive those fees from the Home Office, but good luck trying to complete that form because it's really, really difficult. Now consider the government have successively cut legal aid, and therefore you can't get a legal aid lawyer to help you with your application because it falls outside the scope of legal aid now. What are you left to do? So we run a project, for instance, that looks at getting exceptional case funding for cases. So we can get legal aid lawyers by arguing breaches of human rights. And we'll talk a little bit more about rights and immigration a little bit later. But where I'm going with this is that obviously when we think about all of those reasons there, is it any wonder that people quite often fall into these groups? Because it's very, very difficult to actually get out of one of these groups, really. I know that Rita won't mind me saying that obviously when we met her, she was without leave to remain in the UK and has human rights grounds on which she could remain in the UK. What were your kind of experiences, Rita, and those that you know, of trying to find, for instance, lawyers to find cases for?
I went to Hackney Migrant Centre and I had a conversation with them. I told them my condition, and then they took me to MCLU. So they were the ones that actually helped me to assess the legal age, and they helped me to get a lawyer. They helped me to do everything. But I don't know if it's not the same for everyone. Some people go through this route. Some spend a lot of money from the demeaning jobs they do to get money to pay a lawyer too. So it's different for different people. Some go through this route, while some have to pay. But I went through the legal aid route Oh, that was my experience with them. It was quite straightforward because of the charity involved. I want to believe so.
Okay, and I think this is part of the problem. So I'm only aware of 3 local authorities in the entirety of the United Kingdom who will have anything to do with this. Most of them will just turn around and say you need to have an application in, but no actual help signposting. There are few local authorities that do it well and have reached partnerships with immigration advice agencies and things like that, but it really is not common to see that. So when someone falls into this situation, what the local authority need to do is look at whether there are practical barriers. So that might be, for instance, a late stage pregnancy, severe medical condition that inhibits travel. So remembering that the point of a human rights assessment is to justify returning someone to alleviate destitution, and then remembering that the local authority isn't the Home Office. So in effect, what you're creating is a shadow border guard in this process where the local authority are making a decision to remove someone from the UK, but without going through the legal process of actually removing anyone almost. You've then got legal barriers. So for instance, with Rita's kind of support, we could argue that because we were making progress towards an application, that was strong enough that it would breach her Article 8 rights if she was to leave the UK. And for those that don't know, Article 8, right to a private and family life, and really, really important in this kind of work. Other legal barriers might be a pending appeal or pending applications that haven't yet been heard, waiting for things and stuff like that. The reality remains that those who have differential immigration status, who approach statutory support for homelessness and destitution and things like that, it's quite limited actually who can get that, and normally requires specialist advocacy through the door. So we do a lot of that, and also when it goes wrong we can challenge that in the courts. Despite the fact...
Sorry, Anna asked a question and I'm going to answer her question. Anna, Section 17 on the Children Act of 1989, it doesn't, I won't say it 100% protects the child, because if there's a restriction, the child cannot access that right. If there's a restriction, the child cannot access that right. I hope I've answered your question, Anna.
Oh, was that in the chat? Completely didn't catch up. You're doing really well. Better than I am almost, Rita. And I think on that point, Rita, it's really interesting to think about the role social work plays in that, actually, as almost a decider of future in the UK, and in terms of enforcing exclusions that are to a child's detriment. And the way this is played out in case law, which is really interesting to think about, is in section 17. There's a very clear statement about wherever possible, children should remain with their families. So support should be provided to resolve family issues as a whole. So they use that to say, well, that means we can't provide support because the parent is excluded. Children can't be, so parent is excluded, and therefore the only option is for the whole family to go. Yes. So they use what's intended to be a supportive measure about reducing children in care, enshrined in what is a fairly rights-focused piece of legislation, the Children Act, and have diluted it into this, well, we're now going to use that to say that if your parent doesn't have it, the child doesn't have it, so you're all excluded, and that's what justifies excluding children in there. I will put some reading to this because it's really, really complex how this all plays out in reality. There is some good guidance, and we've also produced some guides for families who are trying to access this support that explains human rights and all of that in a really kind of clear and crisp kind of way. So moving on to my favourite thing to talk about, bit of law. We love a bit of law. When you think about your immigration, this is what you're thinking about. So you're thinking about children in need and also voluntary care of children. Rita mentioned earlier that a lot of people who approach local authorities for support are unlawfully told that if you can't sort out your housing, we'll take your kids away. Now, I've seen it lots of times, and the second they realise that I'm on the phone when they've said that, they normally change their tune quite quickly, because my first question would be, and on what basis are you going to do that? Remembering that section 20 is a voluntary engagement between a parent and the local authority, but it is something to be really, really mindful of, that it happens a lot in terms of not just migration, but there's a massive wielding and misuse of section 20 more widely in the way it's understood and applied. The Care Acts in terms of pregnant women, because pregnancy past a certain point is a care and support need, but also adults with differential status who need accommodation and have a care and support need. You can also start digging into wonders of things like the National Assistance Act 1948 and other such things when looking at this, but that's a bit much for a 1.5 hour webinar, really. The working together guidance, learn it and love it if you work with kids, because actually that is what forms your lawfulness in terms of your assessment, that statutory guidance. Very rarely do I see child in need assessments in NLPF settings that actually follow the spirit or process of that guidance. So it's normally mother says this, mother presented like this, mother had £10 in her pocket and therefore couldn't possibly need any help from the local authority. So use that and think about it. The ECHR, European Convention, is your friend. And it's kind of what I think you should all be here to uphold, really. Thinking about kind of fundamental human rights that we have. When we think about migration and specifically about the human rights assessments that happen, we're talking about Articles 3 and 8. So the courts have, for instance, found that to leave someone homeless and to subject them to homelessness is a breach of their Article 3 rights, because it's an inhumane and degrading treatment. In cases such as Ritas, the human rights assessment would find that it's because of the fact that she has a legal basis to be here as a family unit, that to deprive someone of that is against their Article 8 rights. So it's almost starting and using the European Convention from a position of inclusion and thinking about how it promotes rights. But the problem that we see with human rights assessments is they're often used to deprive people of their rights. It's to exclude and rule out, really. We've already talked a little bit about Schedule 3 and those exclusions, but they are really important. And again, I'll send some guides about them. Section 4, 95 and 98 of the Immigration and Asylum Act, they are your asylum supports and various things. So want to talk about these a little because asylum seekers haven't had a great deal of focus so far. So Section 4 is provided to people who have been refused asylum, for which you get £35 a week and usually a room in a shared room within a shared house. So multiple unknown adults to bedrooms, things like that. In case of families, you will get private accommodation, but you can live on 35 quid a week while you do that. Section 95 is mainstream asylum support. Now that is accommodation and subsistence, which is currently £39 a week to live on. So if you break that down by day, it's £5 a day, under a £5 day that you're expected to live on with asylum support. Mercy Baguma, who died a couple of weeks ago, was on asylum support and poor to the point that she starved to death next to an emaciated baby. That's the level that this gets to. And it's quite often the position that people are in when they approach services like ours. Because as well as thinking about this legislation and how it impacts, the word of all this gets out in communities. So quite often, I'm not sure if Rita's going to agree with me here, but I'm going to put it out here anyway. What I often find is that quite often communities know when services are able to help and kind of pop them in the right direction to, like, our charities, for instance, going, okay, well, it's now safe to go.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah,
you're right.
But I'd never want to imply it too much because dangerous ground, Rita, dangerous grounds. So it's more that thinking about how all that kind of sits together, and obviously the immigration rules, which we're definitely not going to go too near today, because they're changed thousands of times a year, to the point where it's almost impossible to tell what immigration rules actually are. There's addendums to this and addendums to that and appendixes here and appendixes there, small little changes. I swear that immigration lawyers spend half their working week keeping up with the immigration changes that are happening the week before we've got into that kind of situation. What I did want to talk about when thinking about immigration rules is just a little bit about human rights grounds to remain in the UK. So there are three really common scenarios that we come up against. Parents who are foreign nationals of British children. So remembering that we don't have birthright citizenship in the UK. So there was an incredible case a couple of years ago of a woman who had a complex pregnancy. I think it was triplets, arranged to have all their pregnancy care and paid for it in America. On the way to America, got refused at the American border. On the way back to Africa from America, having been told she couldn't come in, she gave birth mid-air and had to be landed at Heathrow. The NHS slapped her with a bill for just short of £250,000 for the NHS care she received while she was here, despite having no intention to be here. Welcome to the immigration system in the UK. So we're talking about human rights grounds. And when thinking about British nationality, those children, those three children there, wouldn't have been British because we don't have birthright nationality since 1983 in the UK. And that's partly where all the Windrush issues come from. So it relies on a set of rules. So an adult who's been in the UK 20 years or more, child who has been in the UK 7 years or more, parents of British national children, and groups such as that. It's much more complex than that, and it's really important to remember this is not simple. It then goes down into, and it's unreasonable to expect someone to leave, or there's insurmountable obstacles to integration and various other bits and bobs. Effectively, human rights grounds are just a massive justification exercise. They're very prohibitive, the immigration rules, when thinking about how someone can regularise, and then also how they're applied once they're not. I have seen the most ridiculous things in Home Office letters. So we worked another case a few years ago of a mother and child, and mother had suffered really significant domestic abuse from dad. Daughter was eligible to register for British nationality because she turned 10, but it costs 1,000 something odd pounds to apply for British nationality, and there is no waiver available for that fee. And if you don't do it by the time you're 18, you've lost out. And you've got to go back through the limited process and go back on and through. So what we start thinking about in there is, how is anyone supposed to pay that? It costs the Home Office just shy of 400 quid to process that application. So for every child that they charge £1,000 to regularise, they're making 500, 600 pounds in profit off a child's registration of their nationality. Again, just highlighting how these rules are grossly unfair. So, good bit. Let's talk about experiences of approaching local authorities. So all of that's gone on, and we start thinking about what's happening. So I've got one little story, and then I'm pretty much just going to leave it to Rita, really, because I think that's the best thing to do. So I remember one family that really, really vividly, and she'd given birth 2 days prior to all this happening, and was destitute and stuck basically in this position where she couldn't be discharged from hospital. And as all of this kind of went on and forward, we started to have sessions where, for instance, a social worker would sit there for 6-7 hours with a woman who's just given birth, to the point that she gets so stressed that she bleeds, to get this kind of assessment done. And at the end of it go, well, we don't believe you anyway. And then it's any wonder why a couple of weeks down the line, the local authority come to me going, she's not engaging with our assessment. Well, I wonder why, really. So when we start thinking about this, we talk about what I've talked about earlier, really. Child in need assessments are treated as differently. Threats to remove children from their families, embedded Home Office officers in child in need assessments, children being interviewed by Home Office and social workers together. Fraud officers present in these assessments, that culture of disbelief, poor individual practice, including some really, really horrifying racism in some local authority teams that I've experienced, and a very us and them attitude between them and people like me, because we're seen as the enemy, because when they step out of line, I will sure as hell take them to court. And they see that as quite an affront, really, whereas I always start from a position of very, very loveliness, really, and work my way up from there. And the reality is that if they work with people like me, we can generally get things fixed a bit quicker than a local authority can. And generally, if they work with us, some do it really well. I can think of one local authority that I very much enjoy working with, actually, and who are lovely and refer cases to us, and we can refer to them knowing that a family will be treated well. But I remember that as a real kind of thing. Would you add anything to those comments, Rita? Because I've pulled these out of our casework and our practice.
What do you want me to talk about?
Issues with statutory involvement, so issues with social workers with families.
Apart from what I've said earlier on, I know the issue. I've not had any issue of racism. I personally haven't had any issue of racism, apart from delaying funds, getting them. Sometimes they know when you go to the authorities, they issue you a temporary accommodation, but they don't know what the place looks like. There was a situation whereby someone was given an accommodation. She's got a daughter, and the accommodation she was given was a 2-bedroom. The person in the next room, he smokes weed, and is a man, and the whole rooms in the house don't have a lock. So she had to go back to the council. But the thing is, they give you a place, they don't know if it's conducive for you. They tell a family of 4 to go to 1 room. They don't know if it's conducive for you. So until getting them to come and see what the condition is, most time is very difficult. Yeah, getting them to come in. I know with the social worker, getting them to come in and then getting the funds going. Those 2 challenges are common with most of the cases I've seen.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of tantamount to some of the issues, and some of that I think is definitely down to organisations and funding restrictions. Local authorities don't receive money for this ultimately, and they've been successively cut over the years. There are challenges in terms of that, but there are also real issues with individual practitioners ultimately being quite liable for what happens in that process and for the quality of the support that's provided. And one of my biggest bugbears, I think, is that NRPF is often seen as very separate from the rest of social care. So quite often it's a separate team within children's services, but in some local authorities, the NRPF team is in housing, but they've just got one social worker that just types up a child in need assessment, for example, but everything else is done by housing officers. And there's a big issue with going back to Lynn Matumba, that the 2-year-old who died. She had a social worker at the time, but that social worker saw very much her role as providing housing. I am here to provide housing. There was another serious case review, I think it was Hackney and City Safeguarding Board, of a no recourse family that there was a death involving violence in a result of domestic abuse. And again, the domestic abuse wasn't the case review identified domestic abuse wasn't really dealt with because focus on provision of housing. So there's this big issue with NRPF seen as separate and possibly not real child welfare work, and being kind of separate and distinct in terms of provision of things. One of our biggest issues as a charity, and I'm sure Sarah's going to scream in the comments when I talk about this, is about refusals to provide interim accommodation. So quite often, obviously, you can't complete a child in need assessment in 6 hours. Impossible to complete a rounded assessment in a few hours. But what we do see is that in those circumstances, interim stuff can be provided whilst that decision's being made via assessment. Our charity spends about £5,000 a year putting families up in hotels because local authorities refuse to, for various reasons. But it's one of my real bugbears, is this: we're not going to provide you anything in the interim, or like Rita said, we're going to give you housing, but actually we're not going to give you any money to live. But here's a food bank voucher, come back in a month. We might have something for you by then. It's these kind of things that are the real issues within this support. Some LAs are very well known to have policies of just point blank refusal on access, where they're just like, no, we don't do that. and that kind of attitude, which ultimately makes people like me very, very angry and very, very defensive for a little while. But it does happen, and I can think of a couple of local authorities where that feels like what it is just this no at the top. And then that human rights assessment we talked about earlier, there's kind of a real unlawful thing here. Rita, I'm going to come to you for this because I've written all my thoughts down. And what makes a good social worker for you in terms of thinking about how social work and migration fit together?
Empathy. She should feel. I know it's not easy for everybody to feel your situation, but for me, she should feel your situation and she should come to your need. Your social worker should be able to come, I should be able to assess my social worker at any point in time if I'm having any challenges, and then she should be able to respond back to me. And I think my social worker should also be empathetic about my situation. That's what I think for social work. The most important thing should be empathy, personally. In my own opinion. Yeah.
I'm going to expand that down a little bit in terms of values and also professional capability frameworks and things like that. A lot of the stuff me and Rita have kind of gone through tonight is really not conducive to that value base of social work. It's really not fitting with the professional capabilities framework and how that should be applied. And there's a real issue here between the relationship between the state, social work, and what happens in the middle. And it's being reduced down more and more each year that I seem to do this. It seems to be more values are taken away, more autonomy is being taken away, and it's being boiled down into this form-filling provision, which is just so intensified in this kind of work when we start looking at the behaviour of some NRPF teams that we work with. Again, some local authorities do it quite well. They are the exception in my experience, but some do it well. And in terms of looking at practically what works here is, I think it's about going back to the basics of what social work's about, building relationships and sticking to your core values and exercising them. Unfortunately, I think local authorities can be quite a dark place to do that in sometimes, when it's not that encouraged to step out and talk. So we end up in weird positions of well, it will do kind of thing, and what more can I do, and that sort of bit. And there's a real tension there. I personally would advocate in this point here that a lot of social work that takes place in NRPF settings especially, there are registration considerations in some of that behaviour, in how dangerous that practice can sometimes be. And it's really important that we go back to the basics of human rights and start looking at this stuff from a position of inclusion. So it's not about, oh look, someone's come to our door, let's find every reason we can to turn them around again. It's, well, actually, let's take a look and see what the options are, and then let's help and find a solicitor to do that, so we can start moving forward to a life that is regularised in the UK and legal, ultimately. And I think that's kind of summed up in the first person you are there for is the person in need of support, not the state. which is kind of exactly what it feels like sometimes when we start talking about these issues. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Rita? I think your beautiful daughter just walked in.
I think you said it all. You said it all. It's basically, like you said, relationships. But for me, like I said, I was more on empathy and accessibility on the basis of experience I've had with them. That's why I said that. But like what you said, relationship is very important, you know. And then I'm not sure if they are all familiar with a lot of policies, because sometimes when you talk to the social workers, it seems like there's a little bridge there's a little gap in the part of knowledge in terms of policies. Maybe, I'm just saying in my own opinion, maybe they need to have more knowledge on policies, immigration policies, and how immigration works. Because I don't think they have so much knowledge on the immigration system.
No.
I don't think they do. Yes.
I hope they've got a little bit more now, though. Just a little bit. I mean, it's a huge topic, and it's taken me years to develop the competence I have around it. And even then, Rita, I still think there's some things I don't know sometimes.
Yes.
Always. But thinking about kind of more philosophically, thinking about wrapping this together and children and how they're impacted by immigration control, the reality remains that children are left homeless, they're left on the streets, they're left in positions of extreme poverty, no school uniform, forced to not access healthcare, denied accessing a GP because they can't prove where they live and they can't provide photographic ID. That's unlawful too. They're told by their social workers that, well, mummy can't look after you, actually. You know, she can't provide for you. That needs to change. I've got one child on my books who first approached a local authority 2 years ago. He wets himself when he drives past a local authority on the bus. 2 years later, he's that traumatized by what happened within that local authority and how that family were treated. They slept on night buses and everything else in between. It's horrific. And my biggest issue is that social work as a profession and as a group of people is silent. Tell me where BASWA is right now on this issue and the level of talk they're giving this. Tell me where even bigger, slightly more marginal groups of proclaimed radicals, where are they on this? Where's this voice? It's not just an issue we can talk about when the next bad article comes up and the next tragedy happens. It's not the kind of issue that we can just go about, because the problem is that it's ethically very complicated, this problem. And you're talking about intersections with issues such as trafficking, more cultural issues such as FGM and issues there, and all the way to kind of the basics of how should we treat people in this society, and then how the state devises citizens and non-citizens and how it all falls together. Social work has no voice in this at all, apart from a very, very marginal few. So I can think of Andrew Jolly at the University of Wolverhampton, who's just aid.
Sorry, Nick, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I also say that it's not only the social workers, you know, it's a two-way thing. Some people don't want to come out. They are in need, but they don't want to come out. So if those are not speaking up, how can they get help? Yes, social workers are silent, but I won't give them all the blame because some people are never ready to come out too.
So what would you say, Rita, about, for instance, how social work, I can tell you that social work used to be quite community-based, and it's not so community-based anymore. So, you know, like me and you, we probably met at Hackney Migrant Centre, I guess.
Yes, we met at the centre, yeah.
And had lunch together at some point, and maybe sat in the toy corner playing with something, or sitting by the piano and reading and stuff like that. Statutory social work has lost a lot of that community. Do you think that might impact how your community accesses support?
If I come up with a good experience and I create that awareness in my community, yes, they will come out. That's the way I think. Because if they need to, like, if they trust me, if my community trusts me, and I've had a good experience with the social work, and I come in to tell them, definitely they will come out.
Yeah. And that's where I think, to bring it to kind of a nice end, because we're nearly bang on time here, Rita. There is a few structural things that need to happen now. There are also, and I've deliberately put this in here because there are also campaigns around all of these at the moment. An abolishment of the immigration system as it stands, and a rebuilt system focusing on human rights as a first and foremost. Immediate end to the no recourse to public funds condition, so that people who are here in the UK can access welfare in a way that is conducive to their needs, instead of being funneled into a system that is fundamentally broken. Increase of asylum support rates in line with universal credit, or better yet, just give all asylum seekers universal entitlement where normal eligibility applies. Another one on that is asylum seekers can't work during their claim at the moment. That makes no sense. I've got a lovely asylum seeking man on my books at the moment. Him and his wife are doctors, like qualified medical doctors. They have sat their GMC boards and everything else, but because they haven't got refugee status yet, they can't be doctors.
Yeah. Yeah,
Seems like a waste of doctors, Rita. And it feels like in this particular time we need more doctors. No, just feels like one of those. Local authorities also need to be properly funded to provide services and to ensure that children and policy, and there needs to be an end to data sharing between the local authority and the Home Office, and also health and the Home Office, and education and the Home Office, and everybody and the Home Office, including politicians when they're contacted for casework, their MPs, and first thing they do is take the email and forward it to immigration enforcement. When that citizen who is being classed as a non-citizen, which brings me back to this idea of deserving and non-deserving, and thinking about those distinctions that we look at. And ending kind of with that deserving, undeserving thing, I just want to go right back and just take back to this, and this idea of all of this around you. How would you feel? And think about how, as practitioners, with this just tiny bit of law I've given you tonight, that hopefully all of you are going to go read up on in great depth. I'll provide everything you need to do it. We'll read up on and get clued up on, because I would like everybody to just imagine trying to navigate this on a day by day basis, and then think about the kind of support we provide, really. Rita, final sentence from you before Siobhan runs away and takes over.
Thank you everyone for coming. All learned a lot today, and I hope everything we've learned today, for me, with the the local authorities, I can say funding is one of their greatest challenge. Proper funding is always an issue everywhere, even at our place of work, funding, you know. And I hope that with everything we've learned today, there'll come a time where there will be transparency between the local authorities and immigration, so the system can work for those that have come into the system too. It's been a good evening. I want to thank everyone for coming to join and listen to us. If you've got any questions, you can send them in. It was nice presenting with you, Nick. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Here's to many more, Rita. Siobhan.
Thank you, Nick. When you get a chance, could you just move the slides on for us to the end? That would be fabulous. But thank you so much, both to...
Too far.
Oh, too far. Never mind. You can reshare it.
We're on our way.
Share it again or not? Or is it?
I can do that.
Okay. Don't worry. Don't worry. It's fine. I can just tell people. It's fine. They don't need to see it. Don't worry. I just want to say thank you so much to both you and Rita. I enjoyed being in the chat tonight because I don't normally... Oh, look at how clever you are. You've done it. I'm not normally in the chat. So I very much enjoyed seeing the chat and seeing how much people are learning from what you were saying, but also seeing how incredulous people are. I think as social workers, we're not well enough educated. We're not engaging with the issues that we really need to engage with. And silence kills. And I think you've been just incredible in the way in which you've presented things to us tonight. And I was just trying to encourage people there at the end. Diana was asking people to share their views on social media. And I was saying, look, if you share your views on social media, we will keep on tweeting them out. Between me and the Social Work Connect team, we've got, I think, 8,000, 9,000 people that we can get this out to. So, you know, post it on social media, say something, speak out, because social workers have to do something and stand up and speak about this. So thank you very much for sharing everything with us tonight, Nick.
I think that, by the way, if people have questions, comments, or want, I notice there's quite a few technical questions in this Q&A. If you're on Twitter, come and find me. I've been retweeted by the Social Work Student Connect page. I've got all the time in the world to answer more technical questions and things like that, and anything else that needs to happen. Just yeah, tweet me and we can deal with it. It's all good.
Thanks, Nick. I noticed that what a lot of questions were about was, is there an organisation like yours near me? And that's going to be, I think, a constant question.
It's really hard. There are, so I noticed for Scotland specifically, the issue is going back to what I said earlier about there's quite a lot of issues that work in migration, but at the same time there's a lot of organisations that are quite restrictive over who they work with. So just asylum seekers and refugees, just victims of trafficking. There's not that many that work across it all. In terms of like national helplines, people like the Joint Council for Welfare of Immigrants have a fantastic irregular migrants hotline that runs, that people can access all across the country. There's us and our advice line. Just look us up online and you can find information about us. Bar that, have a good Google and speak to your local city of sanctuary, because they quite often know the local support networks quite well, and there's usually one in most towns.
Thanks for that, Nick.
Nick, a couple of people have said, how do they get hold of you if they're not on Twitter?
If they're not on Twitter, I mean, you should ask my friends that, because they wonder that all the time. How do you get hold of me? So if you go to the charity page, is probably the easiest thing. There's a contact us job in the About Us thing. Depending on the volume, I can get through quite a lot in a day, but I'll try and be thing. But what I'll try and do first is I'll try and make the resources that I get over to you as comprehensive as possible, so that hopefully that in itself might answer some questions.
That's great, thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And just to say about the emails that we send out, we always send out a follow-up email after every webinar, and we also send out a certificate, but please do recognise that they're not always going to come out to you within a couple of hours, because we're all volunteers, we're all doing this in our own time. If you haven't had it by Sunday, then feel free to email us at the webinar's email address, which is on the screen now, and then we'll follow that up. But what I would say to you is, we're conscious quite a few people have been saying to us, I'm not getting a follow-up email. Please check your junk email and make sure you add us to your safe senders list. I said this in the chat earlier, because we think that's where a lot of them are going. If you've checked your junk email and you just can't find an email from us, let us know at the webinar's email address and we'll see what we can do. But we will send up a very detailed follow-up email with information that Nick's given to us, which will also address some of the Q&A. And we also have some other information from other organisations that have come through to us to send out to you in the follow-up email, which will probably go out on Friday now. I was left though thinking about Nick saying, let's get back to our core social work values. And I think that's really important. Let's get back to core social work values. Social work isn't about working for a local authority. Social work is much wider than that. And I think Nick's demonstrated that for us tonight. Social work is a profession. We have a clear set of values and we need to speak up about issues like this. It's very important. I did hear some of you in the chat saying I was going to do self-care after this, and I can just see it now. Catherine's just put in the chat, I've been shaken to my core. And somebody said, oh, I feel guilty for thinking about self-care after this. But self-care is important. It's going to be our topic for next week's webinar. Yes, we need to speak up. We really do need to do things about some of the topics that we're covering in the webinars, including tonight. But next week, Omar has just put the link into the chat, so you can register straight away tonight for next week's webinar. The week after that, we're going to be looking at poverty aware practice and anti-poverty work, the theory and the practice. And the following week, we'll be looking at exploring models of disability, where we'll be looking at the social model, the medical model, the tragedy model, and also the charity model. And for me, the charity model has really come through tonight, that social workers seem to be just stepping back and letting charities step in. But, you know, Nick set up a charity and that's an amazing thing to do. So,
however, I also said before the webinar started that my one goal is to close it.
There you go. Thank you, Nick.
And my job shouldn't exist.
I think that should be the aim of all of us as social workers, really, isn't it? Is that if we do our job well enough, it shouldn't exist. So, but I thank you very much. For Catherine has put in the chat now, I feel even more determined to take action. I love my profession. And Nick, you talk my language. Absolutely. Nick talks the language of social work. And I was also incredibly moved by Rita sharing with us. And I hope maybe one day, Rita, you might become a social worker, or maybe your daughter might become a social worker, because the things that you said brought such a lot into our profession. So thank you very much. Thank you both for tonight. I'm going to leave you, Nick. I don't know if you want to say one final thing. Nick for Prime Minister.
Yeah, nominated me for Prime Minister.
Yeah, absolutely, you for Prime Minister. So, but we're going to close the webinar in a moment, Nick. But I don't know if you want to have the final word, or for Rita to have the final word. It feels wrong for me to have the final word.
Feels like your final word. No pressure.
Is Rita still there?
What I will say is that I really just hope this isn't another one of those things that we look at and then walk away from. And I really hope it's something that people take forward, talk about. And this isn't just about migrant rights, because we ignore one person's groups of rights, we start eroding everyone's. And this is about standing up for human rights in general.
Absolutely, Nick. Thank you. Standing up for human rights. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night.